Sam Andrew has the face of a Renaissance angel, but his hands play the music of the devil. Deep in the shadows, he weaves a web of sound to keep the woman beside him from falling into the abyss. That woman is Janis Joplin, and Sam is the conductor of her destructive symphony. The world celebrates Janis, but they forget the man behind the scenes. It was Sam Andrew who became the shadow in her descent. While others may have lit the fuse, Sam sat beside her as the bomb of sex and drugs ticked down. He didn't save her. He joined her. For Janis, Sam became a traitor. He turned his back on his big brother brothers, abandoning loyalty to follow her. But what is the price of betrayal? Absolute solitude. When Janis rose to stardom, Sam turned to ashes. She left him adrift, condemning him to decades of struggle with addiction and the shame of being forgotten. The path that led Sam Andrew to the eye of that cultural hurricane began far away from the psychedelic haze of the Haight-Ashbury, back to the rigid, grayscale world of 1950s America. It was an era defined by the stern, grandfatherly authority of the White House under Dwight D. Eisenhower. The United States had emerged from World War II as a global superpower, and the internal mandate was clear. Conformity was patriotism. It was a time of picket fences, identical suburban lawns, and a silent agreement that life should be orderly, predictable, and safe. In Washington, D.C., the president played golf and signed infrastructure bills, projecting an image of calm control while the Cold War simmered beneath the surface. Sam Andrew was born into this system on December 18, 1941. He was the son of a military family, a child of the very establishment that the counterculture would later try to destroy. But while other children of the Eisenhower era were learning to march in step, Sam was learning to look in the other direction. His upbringing was a series of displacements, a nomadic existence that fractured his sense of belonging before it could ever take root. The most pivotal of these chapters was written not in an American suburb, but on the island of Okinawa, Japan. While his father served the machinery of the American military empire, young Sam Andrew was crossing the perimeter wire, both literally and metaphorically. He was a boy straddling two worlds, the sanitized, secure bubble of the base and the ancient, battered, yet profoundly spiritual world of post-war Japan. It was here that the first cracks in the American dream appeared for him. He saw a culture that valued silence, nuance, and beauty in imperfection, concepts alien to the loud, victorious bravado of the United States. He became a voracious reader, a linguistic prodigy who could drift between languages and cultures with the ease of a diplomat. He devoured literature, obsessed over the structural perfection of Bach, and found solace in the chaotic freedom of jazz. He was being groomed by his background to become a pillar of society, perhaps a lawyer, a professor, or even a statesman who might one day walk the halls of the White House himself. Yet, even as he excelled in academia, a profound dissonance was growing within him. He began to view the rigid structure of Western society not as a safety net, but as a cage. In the smoky jazz kissatines of Tokyo, watching musicians improvise with a freedom that American suburban life strictly forbade, Sam realized that true intelligence wasn't about following rules. It was about knowing which ones to break. He saw that the establishment he was born into was spiritually bankrupt, a machine that produced goods but starved the soul, and he decided then that he would rather be a barbarian with a guitar than a prince in a suit. He had the intellect, the pedigree, and the discipline, but inside the chest of this scholar beat the heart of a saboteur. By the time Sam Andrew arrived in San Francisco in the early 1960s, the presidency had shifted from the grandfatherly Eisenhower to the vibrant Kennedy, and then following the tragedy in Dallas, to the imposing figure of Lyndon B. Johnson. The mood in the White House was darkening. The optimism of the early 60s was being slowly strangled by the escalating reports from Vietnam. But in the coffee shops and basements of San Francisco, a different kind of war was brewing. This was no war for territory. It was a battle for consciousness. Sam didn't come to the city to drop acid or wear flowers in his hair. Those cliches hadn't been invented yet. He came as an intellectual seeking a new form of expression. He enrolled at the University of San Francisco, maintaining the facade of the student, but his real education happened after dark. He was looking for a sound that could mirror the complexity of his own mind, something that had the structural integrity of classical music, but the raw, bleeding emotion of the blues. It was in this crucible of experimentation that he met Peter Albin, a guitarist rooted in the country blues tradition. Together they decided to form a band, but they didn't want to be just another rock and roll outfit playing Chuck Berry covers. They wanted to be a statement. In a stroke of brilliant dark irony, they named themselves Big Brother and the Holding Company. The name was a direct, sneering reference to George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984, a book about government surveillance and the crushing of the human spirit. At a time when President Johnson's administration was increasingly viewed with suspicion by the youth, and the FBI was beginning to keep files on dissidents, naming a band Big Brother was a radical act of political theater. It was Sam's way of saying that they were watching the watchers. They were the mirror reflecting the absurdity of the establishment back at itself. However, a band needs more than a clever name, it needs a sound. And the sound of Big Brother in those early days was a terrifying, beautiful mess, largely due to the arrival of James Gurley. If Sam Andrew was the order, the Apollonian intellect trying to build a structure, James Gurley was the chaos, the Dionysian madman who wanted to burn the structure down. James didn't play the guitar, he assaulted it. He was a self-taught daredevil who treated the instrument like a stunt car he was trying to crash. He tuned his strings to bizarre intervals, played through broken amplifiers, and created a wall of feedback that sounded like a jet engine dying. Sam, with his knowledge of music theory, was fascinated by James. He saw in James's noise the raw material for a revolution. They became the perfect foil for one another. Sam trying to weave melodies through the barbed wire of James's distortion. This wasn't accidental chaos, it was a deliberate sonic assault that mirrored the fracturing of the American psyche. Sam utilized his classical training to introduce modal scales and counterpoint into rock and roll, structures that were commonplace in a symphony hall but unheard of in a garage band. He was essentially trying to force the complexity of Coltrane into the format of a pop song, creating a dueling guitars dynamic that predated the heavy metal era by years. While James provided the texture, Sam provided the map, ensuring that their psychedelic explorations always had a tether to bring them back to earth. They played in the Victorian basements of the Haight, creating an avant-garde noise that was loud, aggressive, and often cleared the room. They were respected by the freaks and the outcasts, but they were missing something crucial. They had the power of a locomotive, but they had no conductor. They were a wall of sound without a door. The sheer madness of Sam's reality is best illustrated by the audience at those early shows. They weren't played for flower children, they were played for the Hells Angels. Big Brother was, for a time, the court orchestra for the most notorious motorcycle gang in America. Sam Andrew, the boy who quoted Bach and read French poetry, stood on stage while bearded giants in leather vests drank beer from muddy boots and brawled on the dance floor. Yet, Sam was not afraid. He viewed the angels with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a warrior tribe. He saw a strange nobility in their violence, a rejection of societal hypocrisy that mirrored his own music. It was a surreal tableau, the Renaissance angel playing the soundtrack for the barbarian horde, finding a common language in the sheer, deafening volume. The void at the center of the band was palpable. They tried to sing themselves, but their voices were thin against the sonic assault they were generating. They needed a force of nature that could compete with the sheer volume of their amplifiers. Enter Chet Helms, the band's manager and a mystical figure in the San Francisco scene, who spoke like a prophet and hustled like a carnival barker. Chet told them he knew a girl. He said she was in Texas and that she was different. He didn't sell her as a beauty queen. In fact, he was careful not to. He sold her as a weapon. When Janis Joplin walked into the rehearsal space in the summer of 1966, the air in the room did not immediately crackle with magic. It grew heavy with skepticism. She was a refugee from the conservative South, a girl who had been beaten down by a life of bullying and rejection. She wore mismatched clothes, her skin was bad, and she carried herself with a defensive hunch, like a stray dog expecting a kick. The other members of the band, particularly the wild James Gurley and the grounded Peter Albin, were unsure. She didn't look like a rock star. She didn't look like she belonged in their cool avant-garde boys club. But Sam Andrews saw something else. Sam, ever the observer, looked past the rough exterior. He didn't see the ugly duckling that Texas had spat out. He saw a fellow intellectual exile, a soul that had been bruised by the rigidity of American society just as he had been. When she stepped up to the microphone and let out her first note, the skepticism in the room evaporated, replaced by a collective shock. It wasn't just that she was loud, though she was deafening. It was the texture of her voice. It sounded like it had been dragged over gravel and soaked in whiskey. It was the sound of pain made audible. Sam realized in that instant that he had found his muse. While James Gurley would go on to have a torrid, destructive relationship with Janis, a relationship where hard drugs slowly became part of the emotional landscape around them, Sam established a different kind of intimacy with her. He became her musical translator. He understood that Janis had the raw power, but she lacked the discipline to harness it. She was a wild horse. He needed to build the corral. In the weeks that followed, Sam Andrew took on the role of the architect. He sat with her for hours, working out harmonies, teaching her how to listen to the complex, shifting time signatures that the band preferred. He wrote songs specifically for her voice, songs that would allow her to whisper one moment and scream the next. Nowhere was this alchemy more potent than in their reimagining of George Gershwin's Summertime. While other bands in the Bay Area were content to stretch 3 chords into a 20-minute jam, Sam approached the song like a classical composer dissecting a sacred text. He deconstructed the lullaby, twisting its major key optimism into a minor key dirge that mirrored the dark underbelly of the 1960s. He wove 2 guitars together, not in unison, but in a fractured Baroque counterpoint that sounded less like a rock band and more like a chamber orchestra having a nervous breakdown. This wasn't just covering a standard. It was an act of musical subversion, taking a polite Broadway tune and injecting it with the terrifying uncertainty of the Vietnam era. One of the first fruits of this collaboration was the song Combination of the Two. The title itself was a prophecy. It was about the collision of the band's psychedelic noise and Janis's bluesy soul. Sam Andrew wrote the arrangements, creating pockets of silence in the chaos where Janis could shine, and then unleashing the full fury of the guitars to lift her up. He was orchestrating a war between silence and noise, and Janis was the commander on the field. As they began to play the ballrooms of San Francisco, the Avalon, the Fillmore, Word began to spread. This wasn't just a band anymore. It was a religious experience. The White House of their generation wasn't in Washington. It was the stage where Big Brother stood. They were drafting a new constitution written in feedback and sweat. But as the band's power grew, so did the shadows. The chemistry that made them great was volatile. James Gurley's chaotic influence was pulling Janis toward the edge of the abyss, introducing her to the needle that would eventually kill her. Sam, standing in the middle, was trying to hold the center together. He was the one who mediated the fights, the one who tried to keep the rehearsals focused when the drugs began to take hold. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against the establishment outside that wanted to shut them down, and against the entropy inside that threatened to tear them apart. There was also a third front, a silent but poisonous racial tension that permeated the industry. The press, particularly the East Coast intellectuals, viewed Big Brother with a unique disdain because they were white middle-class dropouts daring to play the music of black suffering. Critics accused Sam and the band of performing a psychedelic minstrel show. They claimed the band was stealing the blues without paying the dues. This criticism ate away at Janis, who was desperate for authenticity, and it placed Sam in the impossible position of defending his art against the charge of cultural theft. He argued that the pain in their sound was universal, a byproduct of the atomic age rather than the cotton field, but the critics didn't want philosophy. They wanted to separate the white soul singer from her incompetent white band to make the package more palatable for mass consumption. He believed, with the naivete of a true idealist, that the family of the band could survive anything. He believed that the music was a shield. He was wrong. As 1967 approached and the summer of love loomed on the horizon, the eyes of the music industry, the sharks from Los Angeles and New York, began to turn toward San Francisco. They weren't looking for a family. They weren't looking for a collective. They were looking for a star. And in the brutally capitalist ecosystem of America, a star cannot share the sky. Sam Andrew was about to learn that the hardest part of being a builder is watching the people you love burn down the house you built for them. The bus ride down the coast to Monterey in June of 1967 felt less like a pilgrimage to a musical festival and more like a troop deployment to a new front line. Sam Andrew sat by the window, watching the Pacific Ocean blur into a gray stripe, feeling the vibrating tension of the vehicle. Inside the bus, the air was thick with marijuana smoke and the nervous, frantic energy of a band that knew instinctively that they were about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. While the White House was issuing press releases trying to sanitize the escalating brutality in Vietnam, claiming a control they did not possess, Big Brother and the holding company was careening toward their own moment of explosive, uncontrollable truth. They were armed not with rifles, but with amplifiers stacked like black monoliths, ready to declare war on the polished, polite pop music that dominated the American airwaves. Sam looked at Janis, who was huddled in her seat, clutching a bottle of Southern Comfort like a talisman. She was terrified. She was about to face the world, and Sam knew that he was the only shield she had against the judgment of the masses. When they took the stage at the Monterey County Fairgrounds, it was afternoon, but the intensity of the performance turned the sunlight cold. This was the moment the family dynamic of the band began to fracture under the weight of a single, undeniable star. As Sam Andrew launched into the opening chords of Ball and Chain, playing a slow, grinding blues rhythm that sounded like a funeral march for the status quo, he looked out at the sea of faces. They were stunned, but they weren't looking at him. They weren't looking at James Gurley, who was wrestling his guitar in a fit of feedback-drenched ecstasy. Every pair of eyes was locked onto the one in the center. Janis wasn't singing, she was hemorrhaging emotion. She was stomping the floorboards, shaking her fists at the sky, screaming with a vulnerability that was almost obscene to witness in public. In the edit of the documentary Monterey Pop, there is a shot of Mama Cass from the Mamas and the Papas sitting in the audience, her mouth agape in shock, mouthing the word, "Wow." That moment was the death knell for Big Brother as a democracy. Backstage, the shift was immediate and brutal. The record executives, the press, the photographers, the entire machinery of the industry that Sam had viewed with such suspicion, swarmed Janis. They pushed past Peter Albin, they ignored James Gurley, and they treated Sam Andrew like a piece of furniture. Clive Davis, the head of Columbia Records and a man who represented the corporate establishment as surely as Lyndon B. Johnson represented the political one, signed them immediately, but his eyes were fixed only on the girl. Sam stood on the periphery, lighting a cigarette, watching the vultures circle, and he felt the cold realization that the big brother he had created to mock the system was about to be swallowed whole by it. The return to San Francisco was not a victory lap. It was the beginning of a slow, agonizing suffocation. The innocence of the Haight-Ashbury scene was dying, replaced by hard drugs and hard commerce. The band entered the studio to record Cheap Thrills, an album that would become their masterpiece and their tombstone. The sessions were a nightmare of conflicting visions. The producer, John Simon, a refined musician who expected professionalism, was horrified by the band's sloppiness. He hated James Gurley's chaotic noise. He wanted clean takes. He wanted tuning. He wanted order. The tragedy of the Cheap Thrills sessions lay in the impossible task of bottling a hurricane. The band's magic was symbiotic with their audience. They fed off the sweat and the screaming of the ballroom crowds, an energy that simply evaporated in the sterile, soundproofed vacuum of a CBS recording booth. Sam found himself in the agonizing position of trying to translate the band's visceral, living sound into a format that the radio could digest, forcing wild improvisations into 3-minute boxes. It was an act of artistic self-mutilation, cutting off pieces of their identity to fit the commercial mold, leaving everyone feeling hollowed out and misunderstood. Sam Andrew found himself trapped in the demilitarized zone between the band and the booth. He was the only one who spoke both languages. He could converse with the producer about time signatures and key changes, appealing to the man's intellect, and then turn around and try to soothe the bruised egos of his bandmates, who felt their artistic integrity was being sanitized. The studio became a pressure cooker. To cope, the drug use escalated from recreational to medicinal. Heroin began to creep into the dynamic, not just as a way to get high, but as a way to tolerate the silence between the screaming matches. Sam and Janis found themselves isolated in their shared addiction, a dark secret that bound them closer together even as the music threatened to tear them apart. While the band fought over guitar tones, the world outside was burning. 1968 was the year the American narrative collapsed. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam shattered the illusion of American invincibility. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was killed. And in the White House, President Johnson, broken by the weight of a war he couldn't win and a country he could no longer understand, announced he would not seek re-election. The collapse of the presidency mirrored the collapse of the band. Just as the country was losing faith in its leaders, Janis was losing faith in her brothers. Enter the wolf. Albert Grossman, the legendary manager who handled Bob Dylan, took over the band's affairs. Grossman was a man of formidable intellect and zero sentimentality. He looked at Big Brother and saw a diamond wrapped in a dirty rag. He began a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to separate Janis from the pack. He would take her to dinner, whispering in her ear that she was a genius carrying the weight of mediocrity. "They are holding you back, Janis," he would say, his voice low and reasonable. "You are the queen. Why are you dragging these peasants with you?" Sam saw it happening. He saw the way Janis started looking at James Gurley's wild solos, not with admiration, but with impatience. He saw her rolling her eyes when Peter Albin missed a beat. The democratic ideal of the band, the socialist utopia where everyone was equal, was being eroded by the capitalist reality of individual ambition. Sam tried to hold the center. He wrote, "I Need a Man to Love," arranging it to showcase Janis's power while still leaving room for the band's psychedelic interplay. He worked himself to exhaustion, trying to prove that the rag was actually a tapestry of complex avant-garde art. He even gave them a hit. Amidst the psychedelic storms, Sam wrote "Call on Me," a song of such tender melodic structure that it could have been a Motown classic. It proved that underneath the feedback, Sam possessed a craftsman's heart, capable of writing pure, accessible pop. But even this contribution was overshadowed. When people heard the song, they didn't hear Sam's elegant composition. They only heard the way Janis turned the word baby into a plea for salvation. His genius was constantly being cannibalized by her charisma, but the poison had already been administered. The breaking point came in the autumn of 1968. Cheap Thrills had been released and was sitting at #1 on the charts. They were the biggest band in America. They had money, fame, and critical acclaim. But backstage, the silence was suffocating. Janis called a meeting. She didn't look at Peter or Dave. She looked at the floor. She announced that she was leaving to form a new group, a soul band with horn players and professional session musicians. She was going to follow Grossman's vision. The room exploded. Accusations of betrayal flew. James Gurley, the man who had taught her how to scream, looked at her with the eyes of a wounded animal. Peter Albin was furious. They called her a sellout, a corporate puppet. They reminded her of the days when they starved together, when they were a family against the world. Janis stood there, tears streaming down her face, trembling under the weight of her own ambition. Then she turned to Sam. This was the moment that would define the rest of Sam Andrews' life. It was his test of character, his moral event horizon. Janis looked at him with desperate, pleading eyes. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed a bridge to her past, a familiar face, a musical anchor. She needed her anchor. "Sam," she whispered, her voice cracking, "come with me." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Sam. On one side stood the band he had founded, his brothers, the men with whom he had forged the San Francisco sound in the fires of LSD and poverty. On the other side stood Janis, the muse, the star, the woman he loved, and the addict he understood. To stay was to choose loyalty, but it was also to choose obscurity. For Sam knew that without Janis, the band was a headless body. To go was to choose glory, but it was an act of supreme betrayal. It was the choice of a Judas. Sam Andrew, the intellectual, the man who read Sartre and pondered the nature of existence, made his calculation. He looked at James Gurley, seeing only a dead end. Then, turning to Janis, he saw the frightening, beautiful future. Sam stood up, picked up his guitar case, and walked to her side. He chose the queen. He chose the drugs. He chose the music. The door that closed on the rehearsal room of Big Brother and the holding company did not just shut out Peter Albin and James Gurley. It shut out an entire era of innocence. Sam Andrew and Janis Joplin walked away from the wreckage of their family and stepped into the cold, fluorescent glare of professional ambition. But the warmth they expected to find in the upper echelons of the music industry was a mirage. The formation of the new group, the Cosmic Blues Band, was less an artistic awakening and more a corporate restructuring. For Sam, the transition was jarring and immediate. In Big Brother, he had been the mastermind, the intellectual leader who guided the chaos. In this new configuration, he was merely an employee, a hired gun brought along to keep the star comfortable, a safety blanket woven from shared memories and shared addictions. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The session pro's Albert Grossman hired viewed Sam with thinly veiled contempt, handing him simplified charts and stripping away his signature psychedelic phrasing. When he tried to discuss art, they stared blankly, waiting for a key signature. Sam was no longer the architect. He was paid to be a shadow in his own performance, a stranger in a land he had helped conquer. The fragility of this arrangement exploded in Frankfurt, Germany. As a politicized crowd stormed the stage, the professionals froze, treating the riot like an occupational hazard. Only Sam stood helpless, realizing the corporate security wall was an illusion. Without the Hells Angels or his brotherhood, Janis was just a fragile bird in a cage of polite musicians who wouldn't bleed for her. As 1968 bled into 1969, the atmosphere in America was curdling, mirroring the toxicity growing within the band. Richard Nixon had ascended to the White House, bringing with him a vindictive law and order energy that sought to crush the very counterculture Janis represented. The optimism of the summer of love had been replaced by a paranoid chill. The FBI was intensifying its surveillance of rock stars, viewing them as subversive elements, and in hotel rooms across the country, Sam and Janis retreated further inward, building a fortress against the world that was constructed of heroin and isolation. They became known as the Snooky and Snooky of the tour, a private, tragic nickname for two junkies who could only really trust each other because they were the only ones who knew the depth of the sickness. The drug ceased to be a tool for mind expansion and became a necessity for survival. The pressure on Janis was crushing. She was no longer just a singer. She was a commodity, a feminist icon, a sex symbol, and a target. The world demanded that she bleed on stage every night. And to recover from that emotional evisceration, she needed the numbing silence of the needle. Sam was her partner in this dark dance. They would finish a show, the applause still ringing in their ears, and retreat immediately to their hotel room. While the rest of the Cosmic Blues Band, the professionals, went out for drinks or slept, Sam and Janis would tie off, finding solace in the chemical oblivion. It was a bond thicker than blood, but it was also a trap. Their fortress often had a specific address, the Chelsea Hotel in New York City. This was the Gothic cathedral of the counterculture, a place where Leonard Cohen, Patti Smith, and Dylan Thomas had walked the halls. But for Sam and Janis, the Chelsea wasn't a bohemian paradise. It was a high-rise bunker. Inside those peeling walls, surrounded by the greatest artistic minds of their generation, they were paradoxically alone. Sam would sit by the window, watching the gray Manhattan rain, while Janis tried to write songs that would explain her pain to a world that only wanted her joy. The Chelsea was supposed to be a community, but heroin turns every room into a solitary confinement cell. They were together in the same suite, yet separated by vast oceans of chemical silence. They were enabling each other's destruction, whispering reassurances that everything was fine while the walls were closing in. That collective delirium reached its peak in August 1969 in a muddy field in Bethel, New York. Woodstock was supposed to be Janis's coronation, but from Sam's perspective on stage, it resembled a fight for survival more than a concert. Janis, drunk and drug-addicted to the point of exhaustion, clung to the microphone like a drowning man to a wooden stake. Sam stood there, amidst a sea of 500,000 spectators stretching to the horizon, trying to use his guitar to keep the rhythm of a performance on the verge of collapse. There was no magical synergy of the Big Brother days, only the desperate efforts of addicts trying to finish their work. As the crowd screamed for more music, Sam saw in Janis's eyes not the joy of victory, but the terror of a cornered beast, realizing that this throne was too vast and too cold for a single person. The music they made during this period, captured on the album I Got Dem Old Cosmic Blues Again Mama, was heavy, soulful, and technically proficient. But for Sam, it felt like wearing a suit that didn't fit. He was a psychedelic guitarist trying to play R&B. He struggled to find his place in the dense arrangements of brass and organ. He missed the wild, open spaces of Big Brother, where he and James Gurley could weave sonic tapestries for 20 minutes. Now he had 8 bars to play a solo, and he had to stay in time. The critics were unkind, and even Janis, under the influence of her new, professional handlers, began to look at Sam with critical eyes. The drug haze that bonded them in the hotel room became a wedge on stage. She started to hear his missed notes. She started to see his lethargy. The man she had begged to come with her was beginning to look like a liability. The tension within the band had been simmering since their European tour in the spring of 1969, where Sam struggled to keep up with the professional demands. But the breaking point didn't snap until the very end of that year, long after the mud of Woodstock had dried. In December 1969, following a run of shows in New York, the frayed tether finally broke. Janis, pressured by her management and driven by a relentless perfectionism, pulled the trigger. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a bottle. She simply made it clear that it wasn't working anymore. She told Sam Andrew, the man who had betrayed his best friends to stand by her side, that he was fired. The irony was a knife in the gut. He was being discarded for the same reason he had left Big Brother. He wasn't professional enough. The betrayal had come full circle. The serpent was eating its own tail. Sam packed his bags in a daze. He was cast out just before Christmas, stripped of his role, his band, and his identity. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his muse. Without Janis, who was he? He wasn't the leader of Big Brother anymore. That role was gone. He wasn't the guitarist for the Queen of Rock and Roll anymore. He was just a junkie with a guitar case, walking away into the cold winter of 1969 as a phantom, leaving Janis to face the lethal year of 1970 alone. He returned to San Francisco a forgotten exile, far from the conquering hero he once hoped to be. San Francisco had moved on. The Summer of Love was a distant memory, replaced by the grim reality of the Altamont Free Concert, where the Rolling Stones played while a man was stabbed to death by Hell's Angels just feet from the stage. The dream was over. The violence that had been simmering beneath the surface of the counterculture had finally erupted, and the music had lost its innocence. Sam Andrew drifted through this darkening landscape, a man without a country. He couldn't go back to Big Brother. The wounds were too fresh, the resentment too deep. Peter Albin and the others were struggling to survive without Janis, and they certainly didn't want the traitor back in their ranks. He sank deeper into the narcotics. It was the only way to silence the noise in his head. The replay of Janis's voice, the memory of the crowds at Monterey, the look on James Gurley's face when he walked out. He lived in the shadows of the city he helped put on the map, watching from a distance as Janis continued her ascent. But even from afar, he could see that she was unraveling. The new band, without Sam, was technically precise but emotionally sterile. Janis was lonelier than ever. She was surrounded by employees, by yes men, by people who were on the payroll to keep the machine running, not to keep her soul alive. Sam knew, with a chilling intuition, that she was drifting into dangerous waters without a life vest. He had been her life vest, tattered and drug-addled as he was, and now she was swimming alone in the deep, dark ocean of celebrity. Months passed in a blur of gray mornings and chemical nights. Then, the inevitable drift of gravity began to pull the pieces back together. By early 1970, the Cosmic Blues Band had imploded. The professionals didn't understand Janis. They couldn't handle the chaos. Janis, battered and exhausted, realized that technical perfection was cold comfort when you were dying inside. She dissolved the band. She needed a home. She needed her family. She started making calls. She called the boys from Big Brother. She called Sam. It was a tentative, fragile reunion. The wounds were not healed. They were merely scabbed over. But the necessity of the music and the bond of shared history were powerful forces. Sam Andrew, despite the humiliation of being fired, despite the drugs and the betrayal, picked up the phone. He still loved her. He still believed in the magic they created together. They began to talk about getting the old band back together, about recapturing the fire of 1967. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed like redemption was possible. It seemed like they could rewind the clock, erase the mistakes, and go back to being a family of freaks taking on the world. That illusion of salvation flickered briefly on the legendary Festival Express tour in the summer of 1970. On that rattling train across Canada, Janis with her new band and Sam with a reformed Big Brother found a pocket of time where the last 2 years of betrayal didn't seem to exist. They drank Canadian Club, jammed all night with the Grateful Dead and the band, and rediscovered their old language of music and mischief. For a moment, Sam wasn't a discarded sideman. He was a brother again, recording albums like Be a Brother and How Hard It Is, without Janis's fiery red voice at the center. It felt like a new beginning, but in reality that train was a rolling Last Supper, a farewell party headed straight toward the dark. But history is rarely a straight line. It is a spiral that moves downward. That joy was fleeting. Janis moved on to form her final backing band, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, leaving Sam to pick up the pieces with the original members of Big Brother. The dream of the family truly reuniting on stage remained just that, a dream. The clock was ticking faster than any of them realized. And then came October 4th, 1970. The phone rang in Sam Andrews' apartment. It was a sound that would divide his life into before and after. The voice on the other end was grim, delivering the news that the world was already beginning to broadcast. Janis was dead, found in the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, an overdose of heroin, specifically a batch of incredibly pure China White that had been circulating in Los Angeles. She was 27 years old. The receiver felt heavy in Sam's hand, like a stone. He didn't cry immediately. The shock was a physical blow, a numbness that started in his chest and spread to his fingertips. The silence that followed was louder than any feedback James Gurley had ever created. Janis was gone, the Queen was dead, and Sam Andrew was left alive, the architect of a temple that had just collapsed, trapping him in the ruins. He sat there, in the quiet of his room, while outside the news cycle began to spin the tragedy into a legend, and he realized with a crushing clarity that he would spend the rest of his life answering questions about the girl he couldn't save. The death of Janis Joplin did not bring silence. It brought a deafening, suffocating noise of canonization that threatened to drown out the reality of the woman Sam Andrew had actually known. In the weeks and months following October 1970, Sam watched in a state of narcotic paralysis as the media apparatus, the very engine that had called her sloppy and uncouth just years prior, began to construct the myth of St. Janis. They airbrushed the needle marks from her legacy. They romanticized her despair. And in doing so, they inadvertently erased Sam's role in her life. He was no longer the architect of her sound or the partner in her crimes. He was merely a footnote in a tragedy that had become national property. He felt like a widower who had been barred from the funeral, forced to mourn in the shadows while the world wept for a caricature. The haunting became literal with the release of Pearl, Janis's posthumous masterpiece, in January 1971. The album was a colossus, dominating the airwaves and the charts, and for Sam, it was an inescapable torture device. He could not walk into a grocery store, sit in a dive bar, or turn the ignition of a car without hearing her voice. Me and Bobby McGee wasn't just a song, it was an accusation. But there was one particular scar on the Pearl album that hurt Sam more than any of the hits. It was the song Buried Alive in the Blues. The instrumental track was already fully recorded, a vibrant, energetic piece, but Janis died the night before she was supposed to record her vocals. When Sam listened to that instrumental piece, he heard the most jarring silence in rock history. It was a perfect, uninhabited structure, a haunted house built of melody. For a sonic craftsman like Sam, that piece was the eternal embodiment of his fate, a builder of magnificent launch pads for a rocket that would never take off. When she sang about freedom being just another word for nothing left to lose, Sam felt the lyrics scraping against his own hollowed-out existence. He had lost everything, his best friend, his muse, his band, and his direction, yet he felt no freedom, only the crushing weight of survival. He was trapped in a feedback loop of grief, unable to move forward because the past was playing on repeat on every radio station in America. As the 1970s progressed, the cultural landscape that had birthed Big Brother and the holding company began to rot. The Nixon White House, embroiled in the paranoia of Watergate, declared a war on drugs that felt like a direct assault on the remnants of the San Francisco counterculture. The FBI files on musicians grew thicker, and the sense of revolutionary possibility that had fueled the summer of love evaporated, replaced by a cynical, jagged weariness. The psychedelic era was over, dead alongside Hendrix, Morrison, and Joplin. In its place came the slick, polished sounds of soft rock and the impending mechanical thud of disco. Sam Andrew, with his fuzzy guitar tone and his intellectual approach to chaos, was suddenly a dinosaur walking through the Ice Age. He tried to keep working. He moved to New York for a time, then back to the Bay Area, drifting through various musical projects that failed to ignite. He studied harmony. He wrote symphonies in his head. He continued his intellectual pursuit of music, but the industry had closed its doors. To the record executives, he was damaged goods, a relic of a messy era they were trying to forget. The cultural insult was compounded by the arrival of punk rock in the late 70s. Sam, ever the intellectual, actually appreciated the raw energy of the punks. It reminded him of the early sloppy days of the Avalon Ballroom. But the feeling was not mutual. To the young kids with safety pins in their noses at the Mabuhay Gardens, Sam Andrew wasn't a pioneer. He was the enemy. He was a symbol of the dinosaur rock, the self-indulgent hippie excess they wanted to destroy. He found himself rejected by the very rebellion he had helped engineer, wandering through a musical landscape that viewed his complex harmonies and 10-minute guitar solos not as art, but as a crime against the new, stripped-down aesthetic. He was the guy who had been fired by Janis Joplin. That was the label that hung around his neck like an albatross. There were nights in the mid-70s where the man who had once discussed existentialist philosophy with Janis Joplin was reduced to pawning his equipment for pennies, navigating the most dangerous corners of the city just to feel normal for a few hours. The disconnect between his refined mind, which could still recite French poetry and analyze the structure of a fugue, and his squalid reality was a psychological torture that few could endure. He was a prince living in the gutter, watching the gold records on the walls of record executives' offices gather dust while he struggled to keep the electricity on, a living testament to how quickly the music industry devours its young. He found himself in the humiliating position of being a legend who couldn't pay his rent. He was a man who had played to tens of thousands at Monterey, now playing to empty chairs in small clubs, the ghost of his former glory sitting in the front row, mocking him. The drug addiction that had once been a shared ritual with Janis now became a solitary confinement. Heroin is a jealous lover. It demands total devotion, and Sam gave it everything he had left. It stripped him of his ambition, dulling the sharp edge of his intellect until the days bled into a gray, indistinguishable smear. He watched from the sidelines as the San Francisco Sound became a museum piece, a commodity to be sold to tourists. He saw the tour buses driving through Haight-Ashbury, pointing out the houses where they used to live, where they used to dream. He was living in a graveyard that was being marketed as a theme park. By the time the 1980s arrived, bringing with them the glossy, materialistic optimism of the Reagan era, Sam Andrew had hit rock bottom. The White House was now occupied by a former actor who painted a picture of morning in America, but for Sam, it was permanently 3 a.m. His health was deteriorating. The years of abuse were taking their toll on his heart and his liver. He was faced with a choice that was as stark as the one he had made in 1968, get clean or die. Unlike Janis, who had succumbed to the darkness, Sam chose to claw his way back toward the light. It was a slow, agonizing process, a reconstruction of the self that required more discipline than learning any Bach fugue. He had to learn how to live without the buffer of narcotics, how to face the silence of his apartment without filling it with chemical noise. Sobriety brought clarity, but it also brought a new kind of pain, the pain of remembering. As his mind cleared, the full magnitude of the loss hit him afresh. He reconnected with Peter Albin and Dave Getz. The anger of the betrayal in 1968 had cooled into a weary acceptance. They were all survivors now, veterans of a war that no one else remembered correctly. They decided to reform Big Brother and the holding company. It was a decision born of necessity. They needed to make a living, and playing the old songs was the only currency they had. But it was also an act of defiance. They wanted to prove that the music they had created with James Gurley and Janis was valid, that it had a skeleton strong enough to stand even without the flesh of the queen. But the reunions were a double-edged sword. Every time they stepped on stage, there was a hole in the center. They hired new singers, talented women, brave women, who stepped up to the microphone to sing Ball and Chain and Piece of My Heart. But for Sam, standing to the left of the stage, looking over at the microphone stand, it was always a seance where the ghost refused to appear. He would play the chords, his fingers moving with the old muscle memory, but his eyes would be distant. He was playing for the audience who wanted a hit of nostalgia, but in his head, he was back in the rehearsal room on Page Street, hearing the gravelly, tear-soaked voice that no one could ever replicate. He was the curator of his own history, trapped in a loop of performing a tribute to the love of his life every single night. The 1990s and 2000s saw a resurgence of interest in the 1960s, but it was a sanitized, revisionist history. Documentaries were made, books were written, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame began inducting the giants of the era. Janis was inducted in 1995, Big Brother and the Holding Company, the band that had shaped her, the band Sam had built, was not. It was the final insult from the establishment. The narrative was set in stone. Janis was the genius. The band was the baggage. Sam Andrew, the intellectual who had taught her about art, who had arranged Summertime, who had been her anchor, was erased from the official record. He was forced to watch the ceremony on television, seeing the industry applaud a version of the story that was a lie. Yet, in this late act of his life, Sam found a strange, quiet dignity. He became the elder statesman of the scene. He wrote, painted, and mentored younger musicians. When he spoke about Janis, it was never with bitterness, but with a profound melancholic love. He refused to let the world turn her into a one-dimensional victim. She was funny, he would tell interviewers, his voice raspy with age. She was smart, she read books, she wasn't just a junkie. He became the guardian of her humanity, fighting a one-man war against the myth-making machine. This wasn't merely about nostalgia. It was a desperate attempt to correct the historical record before it calcified into a lie. Sam insisted on highlighting Janis's discipline and her intellect, pushing back against the narrative that she was just a force of nature who happened to get lucky. By showcasing her letters and dissecting her vocal techniques for new generations, he was trying to prove that their chaos had a purpose, that their rebellion was an intellectual choice, not just a childish tantrum. In restoring her dignity, he was quietly, methodically restoring his own, proving that the Summer of Love was a legitimate artistic movement, not just a drug-fueled dream. That battle wasn't just fought through interviews, but through tireless artistic work. Sam refused to be a passive witness. He became the music director for the Broadway musical Love, Janis. He spent years teaching young singers how to scream without damaging their vocal cords, how to recreate the spirit of the 1960s that he had helped create. And when he wasn't teaching music, he painted. Few knew that the hands that played the Gibson SG also wielded paintbrushes, creating haunting oil paintings, visual works reflecting the chaotic structure that mirrored his music. He lived his final years not as a ruin, but as a diligent craftsman striving to restore a sacred temple that time was trying to erase. He was the keeper of the flame, cupping his hands around the flickering memory of the real Janis, trying to keep it from being extinguished by the winds of commercialism. But the body keeps the score. The decades of hard living, the stress, the drugs, and the sheer emotional weight of carrying the past began to manifest physically. In the early 2000s, Sam's heart, the heart that had beaten in time with the most explosive music of the 20th century, began to fail. He underwent open-heart surgery, a brutal procedure that left him frail and scarred. Then came the strokes. The hands that had once flown across the fretboard with the precision of a mathematician were now slow, trembling, and disobedient. For a man who defined himself by his ability to create, to articulate complex thoughts through music and language, the loss of physical agency was a cruelty beyond measure. He was trapped in a failing shell, his brilliant mind still racing with ideas, with memories of Okinawa, of the Fillmore, of the smell of patchouli and stale beer, but his body refusing to execute the commands. He sat in his home in San Francisco, the city that had changed so much. He barely recognized it, surrounded by books and instruments he could no longer play as he once did. He was the last sentinel of a revolution that had long since ended, waiting for the final curtain to fall. The hospital room in San Francisco in early 2015 was a world away from the sweaty, velvet-draped ballrooms of the Fillmore, yet it possessed a similar kind of suffocating intimacy. Sam Andrew lay in the bed, the wires and tubes attached to his chest replacing the guitar cables and amplifiers that had once defined his existence. The man who had once stood toe-to-toe with the loudest amplifiers in the world, generating a wall of sound that terrified the establishment, was now forced to listen to the rhythmic, sterile beeping of a heart monitor. The irony was cruel and inescapable. The heart that was now failing him was the same heart that had broken when he betrayed his brothers, the same heart that had raced with heroin, and the same heart that had loved Janis Joplin more than it had loved itself. The decline had been a slow, eroding tide. Before his own body began to surrender, Sam had to witness the final departure of his counterpart, the chaos to his order. James Gurley, the father of psychedelic guitar and the man whose wife Sam had once watched Janis steal, had died in 2009. James had died just days before his 70th birthday, passing away in the quiet of the desert, far from the adoration of the crowds. When the news reached Sam, it was like losing a limb. Despite the feuds, the betrayals, and the years of silence, James was the only other person on earth who truly understood the sonic architecture of 1967. With James gone, Sam became the sole custodian of the Big Brother sound, a lonely keeper of a language that fewer and fewer people spoke. In the years following James's death, Sam fought valiantly to keep the music alive, but his body became a prison. He suffered a series of strokes that attacked the very centers of his brain responsible for his greatest gifts, his music and his language. For a polyglot who spoke Japanese, French, and Spanish, and for a musician who thought in complex harmonies, the loss of speech and dexterity was a torture more exquisite than any he could have imagined. He would look at his guitar in the corner of the room, his hands trembling, the neural pathways that once commanded his fingers to dance across the fretboard, now severed and silent. The intellectual rebel was being silenced not by the government, not by the record labels, but by his own biology. Outside the hospital window, the world had transformed completely. The San Francisco of 2015 was a city of technology billionaires and gleaming skyscrapers, a playground for the new elite. The White House was now occupied by a president who listened to the Rolling Stones in the Oval Office. The counterculture had won the cultural war but lost its soul. The music of rebellion was now the soundtrack of the establishment, stripped of its danger. The music that Sam and Janis had created to tear down the system was now used in car commercials and played at presidential inaugurations. Sam lay in his bed, a relic of a revolution that had succeeded only to be commodified, wondering if the kids walking past on the street below with their smartphones even knew that a giant was dying just a few floors above them. The end came on February 12, 2015. It was not a violent explosion like Janis's overdose, nor was it a sudden collapse like James's heart attack. It was a quiet fading of the light. Sam Andrew, the man who had written the arrangement for Summertime, the man who had held the net for the Queen, took his final breath in the arms of his wife Elise. There were no cameras. There was no breaking news alert on CNN. The quiet guardian of the San Francisco sound slipped away into the silence he had spent his entire life trying to fill with music. With Sam Andrews' death, the final bridge to the raw, unfiltered truth of Janis Joplin was collapsed. The world was left with the myth, the icon, the t-shirts, and the biopics, but the human context was gone. Sam was the context. He was the one who knew that Janis wasn't just a blues singer. She was an intellectual who quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was the one who knew that her screams weren't just anger. They were a calculated musical choice that he had helped her refine. Without Sam, Janis became a statue, cold, marble, and perfect. With Sam, she had been flesh and blood. Sifting through the wreckage of this story, we have to ask what it all meant. What was the point of the noise, the drugs, the betrayals and the pain? History, written by the winners and the survivors, often simplifies the narrative into a cautionary tale about excess. It tells us that drugs are bad, that fame is destructive, and that dying at 27 makes you a legend. But the story of Sam Andrew offers a different, more difficult lesson. It is a lesson about the price of proximity to genius. Sam was a brilliant artist in his own right, a man capable of creating beauty and order, but he chose to orbit a sun that was destined to go supernova. He accepted the burns. He accepted the blindness. He accepted that he would forever be defined by the light of another. This is the tragedy of the number 2. In the grand theater of history, we focus on the presidents in the White House and the rock stars at the microphone. We ignore the speechwriters who craft the words and the guitarists who build the chords. Sam Andrew represented the thousands of unseen hands that shape history from the shadows. He was the infrastructure of the counterculture, and like all infrastructure, he was only noticed when he cracked. Ultimately, the story of Sam Andrew and Janis Joplin is a story about the failure of the American dream and the success of American art. They were two outcasts, one from the rigid military bases of the Eisenhower era, the other from the brutal conformity of Texas, who found each other in the only place that would have them, the edge of the world. They tried to build a utopia based on music and love, and they failed. The drugs took over, the corporations took over, and the jealousy took over. But in that brief, shining moment before the fall, between the summer of 1966 and the winter of 1968, they created a sound that was so honest, so raw, and so terrifyingly human that it still vibrates in the air today. So the next time you hear "Piece of My Heart" on the radio, or see a clip of Janis Joplin stomping her feet at Monterey, do not just look at the Queen. Look to her left. Look into the shadows. See the man with the blonde hair and the intense eyes, the man playing the Gibson SG with the fury of a mathematician trying to solve an equation that has no answer. That is Sam Andrew. He is not just a backup musician. He is the man who built the fire, knowing full well that he would be the one left to sweep up the ashes.